All right, I'll call us to order at 5:01. And Liz is going to help out with the minutes because we haven't been able to find a minute taker. So we're going to start. Is there any public comment at this time?
I'll take just a minute to introduce Beth McGeorge. Beth is our new Interim Director of Student Support Services. This is her first board meeting with us. Beth comes to us from the Harwood Union Unified School District, or HUUSD, as it's affectionately known. So welcome, Beth, and welcome to your first board meeting.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right. I'm not seeing any hands up for public comment. So our first action item is to accept the consent agenda.
So move, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Is there a second?
Second, Sarah.
Okay. All those in favor of accepting the consent agenda, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, that passes. Okay, we're gonna get down to executive limitations monitoring. The first item is an update on the Mount Abe lobby.
Yeah, so Floyd's going to take the lead on the updates for the Mount Abe lobby and on the congressionally directed spending. And I see Shannon's online as well. So she has some comments that she'd like to contribute on the Mount Abe lobby. Feel free to jump in and share your thoughts as well, Shannon. Take it away, Floyd.
Thank you. Well, we're excited about the lobby. It's, I'll start where I'm going to end. It's all torn apart and ready to be put back together. We're gaining speed. Everything is torn out. If you have an opportunity, I'm certain it would be a great field trip to walk through and grab Mike Orvis or maybe Shannon and get a look at it. The cost is coming in above what we initially projected, just to give you that heads up. Inflation in the construction industry has been a pretty steep increase in the last year and a half. To quote Mike Orvis, our facilities director over there, we're putting in some windows over the second floor overlooking the gym. And these are words that you will seldom hear out of Mike's mouth. This is awesome. It was just really great. He stopped into my office and he gave me an update, and he was just saying how spectacular it is and how excited he is for the kids to get back this fall and for parents and the community to be up there and looking over our gym through those windows as they come in. Speaking of windows, we did have a little PCB in the window framing. We were worried it had bled into the bricks, which would have really impacted our construction path a little bit. We're fortunate today we got clarity that that's not the case, so we can move fairly quickly with replacing those windows. We do have supply chain issues on some things that you would think and then other things that you wouldn't. For example, we have some motion detector light switches that are slated to arrive sometime in 2024. We're looking for an alternative, and we're fairly confident. Back to Mike Orvis, he goes, just get one of those ones that goes up and down and let's turn the lights on, but we will get there. The steel is in for the walkway around the lobby itself, and it gives you a sense of just how spectacular that will be. We're a little nervous about the finish date. We're monitoring it carefully. We have a local guy, Dan Heath, who worked with Breadloaf as our project manager, and he is spectacular in terms of being able to pay attention to those little details, protect us, get the things done that we need to do, maybe even find a few opportunities to do things that aren't necessarily part of the plan, but are a great value add. Dan worked as the project manager in the past, so he was on the other side. So he's really a great asset for us, and that's been wonderful. And come on over. It's torn apart and it's ready to be put back together. It's going to be spectacular. I'll be quiet. And Shannon, if you have anything you want to add, jump right in. And we'll assume that means she's good. Any questions?
I couldn't find my unmute because I'm on my phone. I would say, in addition to the lobby, that the bathrooms are all torn apart as well. And was quite interesting to be walking down the hall the other day and see giant boulders and piles of dirt in the bathrooms. But they're making great headway on those. And part of those bathroom renovations is going to be including gender neutral bathrooms that are more accessible as opposed to just the ones that are down in the middle school wing. So we're excited and resigning ourselves to the fact that it's going to take longer than we wanted. But Patrick and I were just talking earlier, and the timeline is what it is, and we rather it be done right and be exactly what we wanted. But just starting to see it come together is going to be very exciting for students and the community to come in and see. Even just driving by, you could see like it's all open in the front, which is pretty wild. But the company has been great to work with. They have been really accommodating to when we've had students here and when we had teachers working, and have to re-wax the gym floor. They're really flexible and find other things to work on. So it's been a pleasure. And if you want to see it, pop on in and we'll show you around.
Favorite field trip lately. Any questions? And then I'm gonna jump to the second part, and that's a congressional directed spending opportunity. On May 25th, Patrick got a note from Senator Sanders' office asking for proposals for any ideas on being more energy efficient. He passed it along to me, and we submitted a request, and this is the response. Thank you for submitting a proposal to be funded by congressionally directed spending to my office. It's been encouraging to read the creative, innovative ideas Vermonters suggest to improve our communities and make life better for our people. After careful review of hundreds of submissions, I have requested the Senate Committee on Appropriations include your project in the fiscal year 23 appropriation bills. So what does that mean? We submitted a request that we have solar power on the roof, a water catchment system that catches water, EV charging, and an electrical upgrade. They agreed to fund, let's be careful. They've agreed to move it forward to possibly be included in the appropriation bills. So Senator Sanders is the budget chairman. So we're hopeful that this will go forward more. So we passed that big hurdle. One of the great aspects of this is the electrical upgrade that we need can serve as our 50% match. So we know we need a roof. We know we need an electrical upgrade. And working in this capacity, we may, in the next few months, find that we're fortunate to have a solar array on top of Mount Abe with enough power to cover our district electric costs. There's no guarantees. We're working on resequencing our projects in the event that this comes to fruition. And creating the funding plan that would include taking advantage of matching these funds. The electrical upgrade that is in our capital plan, satisfying this match requirement, be a great use of some of the money that we've already set up in the capital plan.
Floyd, I didn't hear a dollar amount that we might be eligible for.
That's probably the best part. 1.149 million.
That's 50% matching, or?
Correct. That's their match. So we're in for 1.149.
So it's a $230 million project.
2.3 million. So 1.149 million.
Okay.
That'd be a lot of fun, Kevin. Let's go work on a $230 million project.
So, yeah, okay, what did I say?
Oh, man. Well, so great news, you know, and exciting, and one more item for us to be swimming with here in the pool. Any questions? More to come, I'm sure.
Great. Oh, Liz has her hand up. Liz?
What did you say? Because you mentioned the solar panels and something about water.
Well, the water catchment was part of the request. It did get turned down, and so we're trying to figure out how we might be able to achieve that ourselves. The idea being, we know that our fields sitting on top of that gravel pit struggle with water, retaining it, and we struggle with paying for watering the fields just from a cost standpoint. And if we could find and create the capacity to capture the water coming off both the roof, and we're looking at plan to capture the water coming off the parking lots to be able to use that for irrigation purposes.
Great. All right. Anyone else have questions?
Thanks.
Thanks, Blight. Patrick. All right. Our next update is on the informational session presentation. And before we get into that, I just wanted to sort of set the frame that this presentation. As Krista and I were talking about how to prepare for this meeting, we were really thinking about what kind of questions should we be asking ourselves before we get started. This is a complicated issue, and we need a chance. At the last meeting, we talked about a chance to air the differences and understand, sort of find some common ground. So I just wanted to kind of take a minute to say to everybody, one of the things that we learned at RBO and CIB was about listening to understand, not to respond. So I hope that as we hear things, will, asking questions for clarity is great, but I don't want to see us get in a debate, because debating what somebody says, or I hope that will come from a place of trying to understand. I know we have this Save Our Schools from Starksboro, and we're going to have them as part of this discussion. So I just wanted to put that out there for food for thought. What is one of the questions Krista and I came up with was, what is to think about as we hear things like tonight, is what is the impact of another town leaving the district to our ends and achieving our ends? Will it make it harder to achieve our ends? Just food to think about as we go ahead. I don't know how we want to, I see Nancy's on the call, and I assume Nancy, but I don't see Herb, so I'm not sure. Nancy, are you prepared to speak to the email or the information we received last night around the Save Our Schools?
Don, I am on the call.
Oh, is that Herb?
This is Herb. I'm on the call.
Oh, okay. I only see a number. I don't see a name.
Sorry about that. It's the way it works, I think.
Oh, okay.
To answer your question, Don, I was just planning to listen tonight. I may have something to say. Our tax impact presentation you have received, and what I was planning tonight was just to listen to your presentation.
Okay. All right.
I don't know, Herb may have something he will want to say. I'm not sure. So Herb, go ahead and
I missed the end of that.
did you want to ask Herb whether he had something he wanted to say tonight?
Sure. Herb, do you have anything you want to say before we get rolling?
Okay, I'm unmuted. I didn't realize that you wanted us a part of this conversation, Don. We don't have anything prepared. We send out what we think is a reasonable alternative approach to tax projection. Certainly, if you folks have any questions of us, I'm happy to answer them. But like you said, I'm willing to listen to what the administration has to say.
All right. Okay. Patrick, do you want to get us started?
Sure. So as I've understood the context for tonight, it was an opportunity, I presented to the board on what we're seeing as projections on the impact of a Starksboro withdrawal. And there were a lot of questions about some of the assumptions behind those projections. So tonight's presentation is a bit of an update from a presentation you've seen with some more of that supporting detail. We have additional supporting details that are sort of information in the background that we can speak to if there are questions that come up. But this is an attempt to elaborate a bit on what you've seen in preparation for the August 4th informational sessions that have been scheduled. I think the thinking is that we would do one in each of the 3 towns. And we've kind of outlined a draft of what that could look like for that August 4th date, making it to all 3 towns. And so let me share my screen. And it seemed, can everybody see that? Is that coming across okay, Don? Yeah, okay. So what seems important is, and I think important to just sort of highlight right out of the gate here, is that there are reasons Starksboro is looking to withdraw. And based on what we've heard from folks in Starksboro, but also drawing from what's on the Save Our Schools website, at least a few of the driving ideas behind Starksboro's desire to withdraw stem from a desire to retain that ability to decide on the closure of Robinson Elementary School. The town retaining that vote and that authority seems critical at this point, and is a driving force behind the interest to withdraw. There's also a belief that small local schools are better for students and have the students and staff that are the glue that holds the community together. And they believe that the small local schools are something that draw families to Starksboro. And a belief that federal, state, and local funds should prioritize those small local schools. So these are at least some of the things that I think are driving the interest in Starksboro wanting to withdraw. And I just think that's important to start from that, because this isn't an exercise in sort of a mental exercise or an intellectual exercise. There's something desired in making this move, and there are things that are not desired that they've expressed. But there are reasons behind this, and I think it's important to acknowledge those reasons as we start with some of the implications as we see them. So the question that this informational session is really looking to address is what happens to Bristol, Moncton, and New Haven in the event that Starksboro is successful in withdrawing, because that's what the folks that are going to the polls in those towns need to know. They need to know there's a reason Starksboro is looking to withdraw, and they need to know what's going to happen in their towns. And as we see it, we think taxes will likely increase as a result. We think MAUSD is more likely to be forced into a supervisory union as a result. And we think opportunities for students will likely decrease as a result. That's sort of in a nutshell what we see happening as a result of a Starksboro withdrawal in terms of impacting Bristol, Moncton, and New Haven. So from a tax perspective, we project that the tax rate for the fiscal year 24 would be 25 cents greater than it would be in the coming year. That's about $507 on a home that's assessed at $200,000. which is 17% over the current fiscal year, and is $289 for income sensitized calculations. And that's using the median income that we've been using all along in these other presentations, because that's the most current data that exists. And I want to get behind, sort of peel back some of the layers behind these calculations, but I want to start with a concept. Sort of the concept that applies, because I'm going to share what the assumptions are behind our calculations. And there are different assumptions that could be used, but the concept doesn't really change as we dial those assumptions up or down. And the concept really is that a town withdrawing from a district results in fewer students in that district. The operation of the district has fixed costs. There are certain costs, for example, in central office that aren't going to change because Starksboro is no longer part of MAUSD. When you have those fixed costs that don't change, and you have fewer students to divide those fixed costs amongst, the fixed cost per student goes up. And the cost per pupil is what directly drives the tax rate. So that's sort of the concept that doesn't really change as you change some of these variables and assumptions that we're going to talk about. Lincoln was a little bit of a different story because Lincoln is the highest cost per pupil school in our district. So that relative high cost per pupil helps to offset some of those fixed costs per pupil increase. That's why we saw a different kind of impact from Lincoln. And this is now on top of Lincoln already being out. So the impact kind of compounds a little bit. So that's a little bit of why this is a different situation than it was for Lincoln. And layer on the fact that we have more information now about the potential or likelihood of being part of a supervisory union in a successful Starksboro withdrawal. That's another different factor now than when Lincoln withdrew. So when we get to the calculations, I think this is a helpful slide to show the numbers, show sort of what we're projecting for numbers, but it also kind of walks you through the calculation or the formula for calculating the tax rate. So the way tax rates are factored, we take our total spending. And so you can see here in one column, we have our total spending for FY23 with all 5 of our towns. And then we have FY24 without Starksboro and Lincoln. And you can see we take our total expenses and then we subtract out the revenue, which gives us our education spending. We do anticipate our spending would go down for FY24 because there are a number of students that we're not directly spending to provide education for. Those towns would be, right? In this case, it would be Starksboro and Lincoln. And we would see a revenue increase because we would have students coming in on tuition. So we expect spending to go down, tuition or revenue to go up, which lowers our education spending. We divide that education spending by the number of equalized pupils that we expect we would have. And this is where sort of that equation starts to tip away from the benefit to the remaining towns. Because when we take our education spending and we divide it by our equalized pupils, which goes down substantially, we get an increase in our cost per equalized pupil. So you can see that 22,570 or 557 is $2,700 higher than what we're looking at for FY23. So that's a pretty significant increase. And remember, from what's in our control as a community, as a school board, is this cost per equalized pupil. That's how we control the tax rate, is control the cost per equalized pupil. The yield and then CLA and other things are outside of this board's control. Cost per pupil is inside this board's control. So increase in cost per pupil equals increase in tax rate. But this other factor of the yield, this sort of reflects the statewide education funding formula in Vermont. So basically, in a nutshell, the yield is created by the state, the legislature, looking at what, now that budgets have passed, we know education spending needs to be next year. What's that going to mean for dollars coming out of the ed fund? And how much would a $1 tax rate need to generate in dollars to have all of this sort of balance out so that budgets get met with the funds from the state? And so that yield really determines the tax rate. And so when, for example, when a school looks for a big bond, right? If a new school was going to be built for $200 million, a portion of that's going to come from the ed fund. That's going to drive up drive down the yield, which has an impact on everyone's tax rate in the state. So those are some of the factors at the state level. But when we take the cost per equalized pupil and divide that by the yield, that gives us our tax rate. So when spending per pupil increases, tax rate increases. And for each of these items, I'm going to peel back some of the assumptions behind them. So I'm going to walk you through assumptions behind the expenses and assumptions behind the revenue. We're going to do assumptions behind equalized pupils and assumptions behind the yield. So all those factors that create the tax rate, we're going to share with you all the assumptions that we're making as we calculate those. So let's talk about the expense assumptions. So we are using FY24 estimates. We think we're going to be better able to give you decent numbers, decent projections for FY24, more so over FY25, even though FY25, I think, is the earliest that we would expect Starksboro to have withdrawn. Fully appreciate that. But we think FY24, we can give more accurate numbers, as accurate as we can. They're still projections. But I think it's important to note that based on everything we're seeing, we think FY25 projections would only be more challenging than FY24. So we're not trying to sort of paint a less rosy picture by showing FY24 over FY25. In fact, it might be the opposite. There was a question about excess spending threshold. This doesn't have any assumption about that. So there's no penalty factored into any of this. The penalty is suspended right now for at least the next few years. Who knows what the future of that holds? Personally, it's hard for me to imagine the governor or the legislature not having any restrictions on education spending. I think there's a clear interest in sort of curbing education spending. And I suspect something's going to come back, whether it's a spending threshold, I don't know. But also from an expense assumption, the direct costs from Lincoln and Robinson are taken out of those expenses. So you saw in that expense line, the expenses went down year over year. That's because we pulled out those direct costs. In terms of the revenue assumptions, we built into this that 75% of students in Starksboro and Lincoln would attend Mount Abe as tuition students. I do think that's probably a conservative number. It might well be higher than that, especially in the first year. Our assumption is that the first year might start higher and then it might sort of dwindle a little bit. But the trick is that we need to use an assumption as we would be building a budget. So typically our practice has been when we build budgets, and we always have to make assumptions when we build budgets, we don't build into the budget sort of best case scenario kind of assumptions, because that can position us to be in a pretty tricky place when our best case scenario doesn't materialize and it's something short of that. So we tend to err on the side of conservative projections when we're making projections to build budgets. We took that same approach here in assuming 75% of secondary students in Starksboro and Lincoln would attend Mount Abe. And there's reasons for that, right? So Starksboro and Lincoln would have options for how to educate their secondary students. We don't know exactly what that's going to be yet. I don't know that decisions have been made yet. So are they going to be fully choice? Not sure. Are they going to designate one high school, 2 high schools, 3 high schools? It's really hard to know. All but one option for a town that withdraws leads to fewer students attending Mount Abe. The only option that wouldn't lead to fewer students, presumably, is if they designate only one high school as their high school and that high school is Mount Abe. If they designate more than one high school, that's fewer students that come to Mount Abe. if they offer choice to wherever they want to go, that's fewer students coming to Mount Abe. So all of the options they have to choose from, all but one, produce fewer students attending Mount Abe, presumably. Another revenue assumption is under special education. So this does reflect Act 173, but it builds the revenue assumption based on an MAUSD with enrollment only from Bristol, Moncton, and New Haven. So special education funding is shifting to being based on enrollment really more than any other factor. So this uses the information we have about what Bristol, Moncton, and New Haven together would likely generate for revenue from 173. And then any other revenue changes, we stayed flat. So our practice has been when we're building budgets year over year, we always keep the revenue flat from the prior year. It's often hard to predict. We had to make some assumptions here because there's some significant changes to revenue. But anything outside of these ones that we've talked about from a revenue perspective, we kept flat from the prior year. So that basically takes us to the education spending, right? Education spending is your total expenses less your revenue. So now we're at our education spending. We then divide that education spending by our equalized pupil count. And so the assumptions that we're using in building out our equalized pupil count are that we're not counting any K-12 students from Starksboro and Lincoln. We're applying our past practice for calculating equalized pupils based on the enrollment projections, taking FY23, which we have pretty decent numbers on because that's the school year coming up, and rolling that forward. The reason we're using our past practice is because the formula that applies the new legislation around the weighting study is not clear. We are waiting for clarity from the AOE on exactly how that should be calculated. So until that, we feel like the best approach is to use what we've been using to make projections about equalized pupils. We get new information from the AOE, and we've asked the question, we asked it, I would say weeks ago at this point, Floyd. So we're waiting on clarity on how that works. And I think work is underway for all districts in the state, but we haven't received that yet. This also applies the hold harmless cap. So one of the provisions in the new legislation says that you are held harmless to no greater a reduction in your equalized pupil than 3.5% annually. So even though with Starksboro and Lincoln leaving, we would experience a greater than 3.5% decrease, we're sort of assuming that we're going to be capped at that 3.5%. A question we also have into the AOE is, because MAUSD has a change in membership, even if Starksboro stays, we have a change in membership. Do we still qualify at that 3.5% cap, or do we have to reflect our actual equalized pupil count because our membership has changed and it's kind of a reset? We don't know what the answer to that is either. This assumes 3.5% caps us. It could be more significant than that. So for the yield, we're assuming the same yield that we used to build the budget for FY23. Now, the yield that we did get for FY23, which came in months after the budget was adopted, was more favorable, and that produced a lower tax rate. Part of that was because there was something like, I think, $20 million from the Ed Fund surplus used to help drive that yield up. We don't think it's prudent to assume that same fund balance is going to be available to drive the yield up again. And frankly, even the yield we were given to use to build FY23 was a very good yield, I would describe it as. So we feel like using that same yield is a very fair sort of application of what that yield would be to drive a tax rate. So it is less than the actual yield for FY23 in our calculations for FY24, but we think that's the appropriate approach to take in making these assumptions. There were some other questions about sort of merger. So why the only situation in which Starksboro completes the withdrawal, even if approved by the towns on August 9th, would be if there's a successful merger of the two districts. Fully recognize that the warrant articles that were approved by the town of Starksboro give the select board authority to stop the withdrawal process if the merger doesn't pass. What they actually do with that is not something that's within our control. So these assumptions do not factor in a successful merger, in which case, essentially everything changes in terms of assumptions and costs and calculations and tax rates and things like that. But what doesn't change is still the concept, right? I started this presentation around taxes by talking about the concept that fewer students sharing the overhead costs, the fixed overhead costs, leads to a higher cost per pupil, which leads to a higher tax rate. That same concept applies even if we merge and Starksboro isn't part of that merger, right? So a merger with Starksboro is more efficient than a merger without Starksboro, and therefore has a positive impact on the cost per pupil, and therefore has a positive impact on the tax rate. So yes, figures change, lots of new calculations would need to be done, and the concept doesn't change. And we know that reduced efficiency, those less efficient systems, as we said, mean a higher cost per pupil typically. And that higher cost per pupil is either a higher tax rate, or if that tax rate's too high and voters don't support it, that means reducing costs somewhere else, which can have an impact on what we provide for support and opportunities for students. And maybe, Dawn, I'm thinking I'll walk through the entire presentation, then we can go back and take questions. But let me know if you would think otherwise.
Sure. I think there's a lot of information. So just go ahead, and if people jot down their questions, they can, after we get through it, we can go back to it.
Okay. So one of the other points that I made early on in the presentation was that there's a strong possibility that MAUSD would be forced back into an SU. And I think even the Secretary of Education's recommendation that was shared around the merger study committee's work essentially said as much, that there's a great interest in creating stability in the region, and there's belief that in particular in a successful Starksboro withdrawal, that the way to achieve that stability in the region would be to create a supervisory union that would be inclusive of a Starksboro school district, presumably a Lincoln school district, possibly a Ripton school district, and either MAUSD and Addison Northwest as two different districts, or even if that merger is successful, this new larger district would be one of the districts in an SU. And as we've talked about a number of times now, the impact of becoming an SU, moving from a supervisory district to a supervisory union, reduced equity for students. So you have different governing bodies now over those different organizations, which we've seen historically has created inequities. You'd have reduced continuity across the elementary schools. And remember, our elementary schools feed our middle high school, and in a supervisory union, that would still be true, right? So we'd have a Starksboro school district whose elementary students in a supervisory union would likely be going to the supervisory union's high school or middle high school. So that continuity, that reduced continuity across elementary schools has an impact when they all come together at the secondary level. We've talked about the reduced staffing flexibility. Again, different entities, different employers with different contracts potentially make it very difficult to share staff flexibly across those different employers. It also creates reduced job security for staff, right? So right now, if MAUSD is experiencing a staffing reduction, it may mean a teacher has to work in a different school than they were working at in the year prior, but they retain a job. In a supervisory union where you have different employers, when one of the employers, say for example, a Starksboro school district, had to make a reduction, whatever position or person they would have to reduce in that school, they would have no sort of access or ease of being moved to a position in a different employer, because it's, again, a different employer. So that creates less stability and job security for those employees. I think that instability makes it even harder to fill positions. It's already very hard to fill positions right now, some more than others. That instability makes it hard. I would add that unless there's some creative solutions, and there's possibilities for creative solutions, but in the absence of creative solutions, a 0.4 teacher at Lincoln and a 0.6 teacher at Robinson, with under two different contracts with two separate employers, is only eligible for benefits at 0.6. Generally speaking, under half-time, you're not eligible for benefits. So you're only eligible for the position that's more than half-time, and you're eligible for those benefits at a prorated amount given your FTEs. So if you're a 0.6 employee at Robinson, you would get 0.6 pay from Robinson, and you get 0.6 of the medical benefit, et cetera, from Robinson, and you would get none of the medical benefit from a Lincoln in that example. I think that makes it harder to fill positions by piecemealing in that way and reducing the benefits to people who are essentially working full-time. And then you just have the reduced central office efficiency, which we've talked about. It's much less efficient to operate multiple school districts with multiple budgets, with multiple boards. And that increases your overhead cost. And increasing the overhead cost either increases the tax rate or reduces what you can provide for students. And lastly, important to note that in the supervisory union, voters do not vote on those centralized expenses: special education, transportation, central office staffing, food service, technology. Right now for us, that's around 30% of the budget for MAUSD that taxpayers don't vote on. So that's pretty significant as well. And we've definitely heard concerns in the past about that. This sort of highlights the inefficiency and some of the challenges in operating as a supervisory union. Again, this came out of the September of 2016 report that the ANESU Act 46 Study Committee put together. This was the governance structure before MAUSD was formed. So this was the ANESU governance structure compared to the governance structure of MAUSD. So it really just sort of is a nice graphic showing the inefficiencies of an SU. This seemed really important to add as well. We've heard more so recently about the promise that Act 46 was going to save money and that it hasn't delivered on that promise. I would argue that Act 46 wasn't really founded on, at least from my perspective, on a promise of saving lots of money. I feel like I tried to be really clear throughout that process. This isn't really about saving money. Yes, I think we'll save a little bit. It's really a stronger emphasis for me on providing equity in opportunities and outcomes for students. Having said that, Floyd has done a lot of work to go back and look at what were the tax projections as part of the Act 46 Study Committee's work, and where are we now relative to those tax projections? A whole lot of things have led to where we are, but where are we compared to where they thought we would be if we merged and where they thought we'd be if we didn't merge? So this slide shows you back in FY17, so September of 2016, the fiscal year we were in was FY17. The tax rate for that year for each town, you can see. And then in that same blue, under that same light blue on the far left, the no unification projections. They projected in FY23, if we use Bristol as the example, they projected in FY23 that the tax rate in Bristol would be 2.0986. So over $2, almost $2.10. They were projecting, again, back in September, that with unification under Act 46, that tax rate in FY23 would be 2.046. So about a 5-cent tax savings for FY23. I would argue that supports my statement that that's not significant tax savings. But the actual tax rate for FY23 is 1.70. That's a 34 cent. We're 34 cents under the projections with unification. I would directly attribute this to the flexibilities and the efficiencies of operating as a merged district, as a unified district. Our ability to be flexible with staff, our ability to take advantage of attrition. Since merging, we've reduced 29 positions in MAUSD. That's millions of dollars that equates to. We've been able to realize that attrition, and almost all of those, the vast majority of those have happened without reductions in staff. Like, people haven't had to be fired basically to create that. We've mostly not filled positions that have become vacant for other reasons. I do not think we could have achieved that in a supervisory union structure. So the narrative that Act 46 has not saved us money isn't true. It's true that our taxes haven't gone down, but they have gone up far less under our merged district than they were projected to if we had not merged. So I just think that's important to consider as well as we think about potential impact going forward. And so we also talked about the impact this could have on opportunities for students. And so much of what we've been talking about so far really has to do with efficiencies and spending, et cetera. And to me, those are all means to the end, right? Spending is the means to the end of what we provide our students. And when we have higher overhead costs, that reduces the spending we can attribute directly to activities serving students. And so fewer students from Starksboro coming to Mount Abe could mean reduced academic offerings, reduced co-curricular offerings, and reduced support for students. Because again, in this context, this is Starksboro leaving with Lincoln already having been gone. We haven't experienced Lincoln gone yet, but Lincoln has withdrawn. And we will experience that impact, and now that will be compounded should Starksboro complete their withdrawal process. So these are, in particular, looking at the combination of the two towns and the potential for reduction in the secondary students in particular, but also the impact on the cost per pupil across the district. The result could be these reduced academic and co-curricular offerings and support for our students. But I think this is a point Krista made at one point. It's also important this is all sort of what could be lost, right? And it's all true, but it's also important to think about what could be gained by staying together. Part of that is a more stable tax rate. And I think we've demonstrated over time through our Act 46 unification what can happen with a tax rate given those flexibilities and staying together and et cetera. And part of that's driven by the lower overhead cost per pupil. I think it also creates stable, possibly even increased support for and opportunities for our students. And just to be clear, this is if we stay together and the merger is successful. Much more stable, potentially, maybe even probably increased support and opportunities for students. Exactly what that looks like, there's a lot of decision makers that need to be elected and hired to lead that work, but there's opportunity for that. To me, one of the most important pieces, greater equity for our students. Having consistency in governance, consistency in budgeting, consistency in application of spending and resources creates greater equity for our students. You know, I have concerns, as I think others do, for a small school district that has maybe even one student that has really significant needs that is $200,000 a year. When that's 10% of your budget. How does that impact your ability to serve that student well and all of the other students in your district well? It drives some equity questions. I also think I genuinely believe the greatest protection for small schools is staying together and merging. finding those efficiencies, saving the dollars. It gives that better financial security. I think there are better safeguards for closure in the articles of agreement that have been approved, and today were approved by the State Board of Education to move forward. No school closes within the first 4 years of operation. That's 5 years from now if everything is successful. So that's 5 years guaranteed no school closes unless the town where that school sits votes to close it. And in the one case where there's multiple towns, it would be the majority of the aggregate of those towns in that vote. And then even after those years, those first 4 years of operation, it takes a 2/3 majority of the board that then exists to approve warning a vote. And then the vote of the electorate of the new district, so that would be all 10 towns or 9 towns or 8 towns, depending on how that materializes. Then it takes 2/3 of that electorate to close a school. So really high bar, appropriately so. So for those reasons, I think this is the greatest protection for small schools. And improved staff recruitment and retention. And we now know towns can still withdraw from a merged district. So that doesn't go away. Different threshold, absolutely. It's not the same process. There's a higher bar for demonstrating that withdrawal can happen successfully, absolutely. But there's still a process, and towns can still withdraw if that's what they want to do, if they think that we're headed down a path that doesn't serve their students or their community well. I think that wraps it up. So Floyd and I are happy to go back any more layers you need on projections and assumptions and things of that nature. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I can see faces.
So if board members want to raise their, I see Steve has his hand up. Perfect.
Yeah, Patrick, just wanted to step back to your assumptions on K-12 students from Starksboro and Lincoln not attending.
And is it most helpful if I share my screen and pull that slide back up, or is that less helpful because faces go away?
The slides are probably helpful.
Okay, let me just share again then.
And it's a simple question. I mean, I'm assuming that you're wiping the slate saying K-12 and not K-6, and then parsing back tuition students for the 75% that might attend Mount Abe. Is that how this is working?
Right, so we would no longer, and Floyd, you can chime in here, but we would no longer get to count any of the K-12 students in this case, Starksboro, but really Starksboro or Lincoln, toward our equalized pupil count. We get revenue from students that attend and pay tuition, but we don't get to count any K-12 students in our equalized pupil count.
Okay, I think that was an important point to clarify.
So that's on this slide, that's why you see that, over 400 student reduction in equalized pupils. That's because we don't get to count any K-12 from, at this point, it'll be Lincoln and Starksboro.
Kevin has his hand up.
So I've got a couple questions, I think. With Act 173 going to a block grant, I guess you'd call it, the allocations by student population or equalized students or whatever, that would all still get processed through the central office and then distributed. Okay, backing up, assuming, and my big fear in this whole thing, is with a supervisory union. If it ends up being a supervisory union that we talk about, the allocations would come through a central office and then get distributed by student population to each district school, I guess. So that's kind of, is that a pass-through thing?
That's a good question, Kevin. I don't know if Floyd knows the answer to this. I'm curious if those funds come through on a by district basis, or if you are an SU, if it would come to the SU. Special education is centralized, so presumably it would, but I don't know that that's necessarily true. But I think you raise a good point, and something I'll highlight here. Because it's based more so on your enrollment, right? The number of students you have, more so than how many students you have that are on IEPs, for example, and what those needs are. A school that, if we have two schools that have the same enrollment, the same number of students, K6, for example, and one district has low need and the other district has high need, they're going to get relatively equal block grant funds under 173, even though they have pretty different needs in special education. Now, over a whole district, we're able to sort of allocate resources where they need to be within the district that has multiple schools, like MAUSD currently exists. But if the district is Starksboro, and you're going to get funds based primarily on the number of students you have, not based on your relative high need, what that means for providing services to students is a concern.
Okay, and then I guess I've to kind of follow on again with the supervisory union where students get or separated. In this case, I guess it could be separated, where students are tuitioned out. So if a student in junior high or high school comes to Mount Abe with special needs, the money would go to either Starksboro or Lincoln, for instance, as part of their block grant. Does any of that money follow that student with those needs if they go to wherever they go for high school?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak to exactly the formula, but I do think there typically is additional funds. So there's your tuition rate, right? And then there may be additional needs that a student might have above and beyond that tuition rate. And I think for particular cases of students in IEPs, at least historically, there has been sort of a mechanism for additional funds to follow. Under this block grant, I'm not exactly sure how that would work. Floyd, I don't know if that's a layer you've delved into.
I'll give it a shot. One of the questions that I've reached out to Brad Janes on is this particular issue: is does the money follow the student? If the expense exceeds the new district or new town's allocation, who's responsible? Is the newly created supervisory union responsible for those additional costs? Under a supervisory union, the chargeback to the towns is not voted on, and the supervisory union is able to charge those costs. For clarity, we're just not there yet under this structure. It would seem to make sense that the cost of educating the town's student falls on the town, but we don't have clarity on that.
And then I've got a question about equalized pupils as well. Somewhere you said you were using the old system, which I would imagine is pre-weighting study, waiting for clarification on AOE or update, essentially. So I guess that's, would I be correct in assuming that that since we've determined or we believe the weighting study is going to be a negative impact, that if we're considering the old system, it may be optimistic as compared to what the reimbursement might be with the weighting study? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll give a high level, Floyd, and you can dig a little deeper. But yeah, so yes, if the weighting study has a negative impact on the number of equalized pupils in MAUSD, absolutely, that's going to drive up the tax rate from where we're talking, because the cost per pupil goes up. One of the hard parts about applying the weighting study right now is there's a piece of the formula that is sort of a truing up at the state level of the equalized pupil count at the state. And that happens toward the tail end as a lot of other projections are happening for each district. That's why we typically get our equalized pupil count pretty late in the game. And sometimes it even changes after the board's adopted a budget because that truing up hasn't happened yet. It doesn't usually change by a lot in the end. But I think it's that understanding how the truing up happens at the state level is one of the bigger hangups in knowing how to run the formula with a new weighting study. But Floyd, feel free to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's right on the nose. And you can add to that, that as with the new weighting study, and I've run some numbers with applying the weighting to our current average daily membership, and the numbers are far different than where we are now. So if I were to, for example, say where we would be at 1,570 equalized pupils, that the end result where it trues up is the state's calculation on an equalization ratio. It's currently stands about 94, 95% of your raw number of equalized pupils. What we don't know is all these schools are going to have new equalized pupil raw numbers, and it's a finite number from the state standpoint, or it's a drastic change in the yield based on an inflated number from your equalized pupil. Again, that's a question asked directly to Brad well over a month ago that they haven't been able to work through what those calculations are going to look like so that we can give some advice to our towns on what it may look like for the 3 that remain, for the 2 that leave. It's murky at best. So the best and most prudent assumption is to move forward that the number of people we have, given a formula to get an equalized pupil, and comparing that is a way to compare the different numbers. It's going to be interesting as they pull this out to us, and we're all the business managers are wrestling with it, trying to get some sort of sense on how do we apply the formula and then use it without having the final true up, as Patrick called it, to give us what the real number is.
And this is where I think it's important to remember the concept that I shared, right? Regardless of how the sort of calculations will happen in the weighting study, an MAUSD without Starksboro has fewer equalized pupils than an MAUSD with Starksboro. And again, those fixed costs divided by fewer equalized pupils, however few, right? We don't know that yet, but it will be a higher fixed cost per pupil without Starksboro.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question or need more clarity? Do board members mind if I take a question from Nancy?
No.
Okay. Nancy?
Thank you. One of the very encouraging things about this presentation, Patrick, was when you talked about the possibility for creative solutions. I think you were talking about some of the aspects of things that you're worrying about if we're made to become a supervisory union. And I see too a possibility for some very creative solutions that would be really good for kids, and that would create opportunities that that really have been that would help mitigate some of the obstacles in the current model that we're using. But aside from that, my question is really about the process for August 4th. The presentation you've given is very lengthy and thorough. I think it has some things we might dispute. But apart from that, I think the purpose of the meetings on August 4th is to give voters a balanced opportunity to weigh their options when they're facing on August 9th the ratification vote question. And so I'm wondering about, you talked last time about the possibility of having town moderators in the 3 towns run the meetings. And I think that would help make sure that there's a balanced opportunity in terms of time for different perspectives to be presented. So I'm wondering about who's going to be facilitating those meetings and how much time will there be in each meeting given the necessary decision to hold 3 of them in one day. I just think that it's going to be important to consider what time there is and who's going to run the meetings, who's going to facilitate them, and how to make sure that there's going to be room for many voices and many questions.
And I'm going to assume that question was directed to the board and not to me. So I'll let you either field that one or kick it to me.
Well, I do, Patrick, have you heard back from the moderators in the town?
As I understood it, I thought Krista was reaching out to the moderators to see their interest. I can answer the time piece. What we kind of mapped out, Nancy, had us starting at 5 p.m. in one of the towns. I forget exactly which was first, maybe Moncton, and had it ending at 8:15. So those sort of seemed like the earliest we could reasonably start and about the latest we could reasonably end. And with transportation time in between sessions, that gave us about 45 minutes total in each town. So it's not a lot of time. That's adjustable. There's nothing set in stone on that right now, but that's either we'd have to either start earlier or end later than what is proposed to increase that 45 minutes. That leaves 30 minutes in between. So basically it would leave 30 minutes to get from Moncton to Bristol, set up the owl and all the tech and be ready to go, which I don't think we can really do with any less than that.
So if we're talking about 45 minutes in each town. The presentation you've given, I didn't time it, but it's probably at least 30 minutes. I just wonder if there's some way to make sure that there's room for different perspectives and plenty of time for people to ask questions and have those questions get a reasonable answer. And I'm just also thinking that it's going to be really important to have an impartial facilitator at each town. I hope the moderators would agree to do that. In our town, I think the moderator, tries to make sure that the presentations have a limited amount of time and that there's and that additional points are made when people respond to other people's questions.
So I don't know that I have information on that, Nancy, because I know each moderator is different. And so, and I don't have that piece of information from Krista. So I'm sorry to say, I don't think I can really answer how it's going to work in each meeting at this point. I see Kevin has his hand up. Do you have some information, Kevin?
Can I just say, as long as we know that you're working on finding impartial moderators for the meetings, whether they would be town moderators or some other facilitator, if we know that, I mean, I think that's helpful to us in our planning as well.
Okay.
And can we assume that then?
That was what we talked about at the meeting earlier. My months have blended together, but that's what we talked about.
Okay, great.
So Kevin, did you have something to add to that?
I guess, well, not add. I had to leave early because I had a conflict, a hard stop at the last meeting. So this whole moderator format kind of thing is kind of new to me. I was thinking that district would present the information to the voters, but it sounds like it's going to be more than that.
At the last meeting, we talked about having help running the meeting. Patrick, do you have something to add? Nope.
Oh, there was talk at the last meeting about a moderator at each of these. I don't know that there was an official motion made to secure moderators as much as it was an idea that seemed to be in agreement. That's all I would have to offer.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I can't check in with Krista right now. So I'm going to see her tomorrow, and we can check in about that and get word back when I see Krista. But that was my understanding. That we were going to look for somebody to help run the meeting, since we no longer have a moderator for the school district. So. Any other clarity needed about the presentation? Steve?
So Don, this is Herb Olson. Are you in the time period for your meeting where you can take some comments or what?
Well, I was calling on people. Did you want to say something?
I will. I just want to do it at an appropriate time, Don.
Okay, well, I called on Steve, and then I'll come to you next.
Okay.
Steve?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that we might want to be prepared in a short time frame to gather or provide an avenue for people to ask questions that are followed up with after the meeting. And, you know, it's likely in a short time frame that you're not going to get all people's questions either fielded or answered, especially with something this complicated. So that we should have some kind of a published kind of thing at the beginning. You know, when we're all through, if we don't call on you and you don't get your question answered, email X, Y, and Z, and we'll provide a response. You know, we might have to even give a deadline for a response because obviously the vote is going to happen pretty soon. So, but that might be one way to relieve the time pressure.
Right, and we have done that in the past where we've compiled questions as we get them, and so we could, when I see Krista tomorrow, I can definitely bring that up. Krista sort of worked on a timeline with some communications going out regularly, so we may be able to add that in the communication that Krista has been working on. You saw a piece of it last night with that came out to share on Front Porch Forum. Sarah?
Sorry. I was just wondering if this was recorded, then are we allowed to post the recording of this, like, or shorten it down to just the presentation to people so that they've had an opportunity to see it in advance, and then when they come to the meeting, then they might have their questions already prepared or can do it in advance? Is that an option or no?
So Don?
Yeah, Steve.
I know Krista had put out something to post on FPF that was going to provided a link to the website to look at the video for this meeting.
Mhm.
I know that announcement request for posting came out pretty late yesterday. I didn't even get a chance to put it up on FBF. So,
Right.
but it might be reformulated so that people can click on the link for this meeting and see the presentation. I know editing it might be difficult, but they could at least fast forward through it if they wanted to get to the presentation.
Okay, I'll mention that when we. Okay.
I think you're going to call on her. weren't
I
you?
was. I was just. I'm just jotting down. Herb.
Yeah, are you recognizing me, Don?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. I think, Don, you mentioned at the beginning that you were hopeful that this could be a listening session rather than a debate. Unfortunately, we obviously Starksboro disagrees with the assumptions that MAUSD has made, especially around the projected tax increase. We sent out, I hope every member has that, our own assumptions, which we think are quite reasonable. If those assumptions are used and using what we think are more appropriate base years, more appropriate expenditures over time, the picture looks a lot different. If you compare the tax rate to fiscal year 2024 is the tax rate that the district decided to use for comparison purposes, and they compared that to FY73, which for a number of reasons that we suggest talk about, we don't think is a reliable base year. And so it's either instead of the 17% the administration has been presenting, we have either 5.7% if you use what we think is an appropriate FY23 comparison, or a reduction of 3.3% if you use what we think is a more reasonable base year of FY22. So it was just really unfortunate. You had basically a repeat of what the administration said back in June. We spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of time trying to get information from the district and then putting it together, and we've heard nothing. So I'm worried. I think that Nancy mentioned she was worried too. You know, what's going to happen at this informational meeting? And it sounds to me that the district is going to make their same presentation, what they did tonight, and maybe other points of view are going to be recognized. And I just don't think that's a good way to do business. I think it's really unfortunate. And I hope the board can see its way clear to improve this process of dialogue between Starksboro and the district. We've asked for that before and have been refused. We'd still like to take you up on that. It's just really, really unfortunate. We're heading down a road where the Mount Aid is going to say 17%, 17%. And it sounds like a scare tactic to me, folks, and I don't think that's the way we should be doing business in this district. Happy to entertain any questions.
Any other questions?
Oh, gosh. Here we go. Ships passing in the night again.
Herb, what would be your suggestion to holding a meeting that would be more productive? I mean, you're sort of throwing this out at us and expecting kind of an immediate response. Do you have a
Yeah, no, I understand.
Do you have kind of a plan for what you, aside from having a moderator who would then, you know, allow you some time to have a rebuttal?
Yeah, but I think I would include, Steve, some dialogue between our group, between Starkspur and the administration around some of these numbers. You know, otherwise, I think, Steve, we're going to go into that meeting, the informational meeting, and like I say, we're going to be, you know, one ship going one way, the other ship going the other way, and there's how are people going to decide which version of the analysis is more accurate? And I'm worried that we're going to descend into, you know, a pretty vigorous advocacy debate. And I don't think, I mean, we'll do that, but I don't think it's the best way for the district to handle this.
So, I don't know, Patrick, if you're able to respond to the ability of you and Floyd and Nancy and Herb getting together and kind of trying to work through the numbers a little closer and see if there's a more reasonable layout that maybe shows a range. I'm just trying to throw out suggestions here.
I know there have been conversations, like I think today, Floyd had a conversation with Susan Klaber, who's working with Nancy and Herb about some of the figures. I think there's been some dialogue around the figures. I'm not sure we see things the same way. But there's been sharing of information, lots of information. There's been some dialogue. Happy to stay in those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, this meeting is our opportunity to try to avoid what Herb is talking about. You know, it's, you know, we should at some level be able to understand what we're both going to bring to the meeting and not have, you know, a big debate at the meeting as much as we can avoid. There are a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, Steve, and I guess if I can add, I'm thinking as I'm going here, Steve, you know, I think we may not, like Patrick says, we may not agree on these financial assumptions and what the projected tax rate is going to be. So, yeah, I think it would be helpful to try to bridge that gap, but I understand, I recognize it might not happen. But I do think there needs to be an opportunity for the other side to be heard. If we go into the informational session and we're talking about 45 minutes and that Patrick is going to be talking or Floyd, and then there's a 15-minute question and answer, the public is just simply not going to get the other side of the story. I don't know what to do about that, Steve. I really don't know.
Kevin?
I'm sorry. It was a good question, Steve. I just don't know.
I've got mixed feelings, so I probably will end up saying something out of line, but here I go. This is a responsibility of the district to lay out what the risks are going to be to the district. There is a wide gap on the financials, obviously, and I think the Starkspur group has massaged them and used a little bit here, a little bit there to make it a whole lot more attractive. And at the end of the day, whether you're 5% increase in budget or 15 or 10%, the bottom line is we're increasing budget because of the reduction of students. And I hate to see this presentation, which is pretty even keeled, quite honestly, get ramrodded by some debate about some tangential assumption or whatever. And the bottom line is the costs are going to increase. And we go back to the Lincoln thing. We had different numbers, and we ended up saying, "Oh well, okay, you're right," and everything. But I don't think we need to. We made assumptions. Nate Levison was very complimentary about the professionalism and depth of knowledge that our business office has. And I have confidence in those numbers. Are they perfect? Probably not. So maybe it's 10% or something. I don't know. And I'll go back and hit on the bigger concern I have is if the 3 towns allow Starksboro to leave, and we will end up, I believe, I think the state, I think AOE and SBE has said enough to not, maybe they'll do it, they will do it, turn us into a supervisory union with all of those headaches and inefficiencies. And I know there were some comments at this meeting by an individual that, oh, that's a great thing, but it's not. It's just like a dotted line charts and shared responsibilities just don't work. So I think this district needs to kind of like understand that where they're going with the presentation. Like I said, I don't have a problem with it. And if it's 10% instead of 17%, it's still significant, and it's not going to save this district money if Starksboro leaves.
Okay, Liz?
I will look forward to sharing, hopefully being able to share out the presentation that we have here. And also certainly I watched Lincoln when they did community informational sessions, and they were up on Neat TV, and I was able to watch those at my convenience, right? So I think that there are definitely opportunities for everyone to have their voice and get it out to the community.
Okay, Sarah LaPearl.
One thing I don't want to have occur, I have 2 comments, I'd like added in is that we will be doing way more community engagement about the merger. I do not want this to be a scenario where that is the information, or that's really the only time people kind of ask questions about that, or they use this as a spot for that. So I really want to make sure that we state that that's where we are in the process for the merger. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is that I also am completely petrified of the supervisory union model. And I would say that I think that something that's not in there that is true is that if it went to a supervisory model, like these 3 towns have full control over K through 12, and that the other 2 towns, should they be put into it, actually do not have any control over what occurs at the middle and high school levels. And I think that would be very complicated with the superintendent about how those towns would ask for services for that age group, even though their school districts do not cover that age group. And I think that's just something we need to really clarify, that those 2 towns leaving have only control over their K through 6 students and not the rest of their students. Thank you.
And Nancy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, I'm not sure that there will be time in these informational meetings to talk about this other aspect, but our differences of views aren't just about what the tax impact will be. I talked a little bit earlier about a reference to Patrick saying there are creative solutions. There are some downsides potential downsides to a supervisory union model. And I can really see why Patrick particularly would be worried about that model. But I do think that there are some upsides too. And I think that because of what we've learned over the last few years as a merged district, and because of what we learned before we merged when we were a supervisory union, we could, if we work together, find some creative solutions to make the best of that situation. And I do think that if we could think creatively together, we might find opportunities that really would be good for kids and would not and would mitigate the downsides that Patrick listed in his slide. So I don't think we should close our minds to that. I know that there's some question about whether it's even the state boards within their authority to define us as a supervisory union, although we know it's within their authority to define district lines and to assign superintendent's office services to a particular withdrawn school district. But I mean, I think there are many questions here, and that we have the capability to work creatively together if we're willing to enter that with open minds. So I think we have a lot of talking to do. I hope we have an opportunity to do it. I'm sure we won't have that opportunity in 45 minutes in each town on August 4th, but I would look forward to having that conversation.
Okay, thank you. I haven't heard from a couple of board members. I see Chris and Bailey. I just want to give you an opportunity to add something to the conversation if you want. And Aaron.
And I think Aaron has her hand up, Don.
Oh, okay. I can't see. Oh, there it is. Oh, all right. Go ahead, Aaron.
I used a very pale hand. Sorry. So I wanted to just go back to Liz's comment about how she was able to watch Lincoln's presentations on ETV as she, saw fit or however. And I just wondered, what power does Starksboro have as far as disseminating information to people? Are they limited because the district is supposed to now be in control of doing the informational stuff and things like that? And if they are limited, then how do we help them get out? I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around. Lincoln had all these opportunities to put out their numbers and their platform and their structure and how they got there. However they saw fit to do that. And Starksboro, I don't know if they have the same sort of power or ability. So I'm struggling a little bit with that concept of now we're in control of all of that. Not that that's a bad thing, but just wanting it to be sort of even. And then how do we make it feel more even? So I'm just sort of throwing that out there as just a question about what, do they have control over what's put out or no?
I don't think there are any restraints on what they can put out. I mean, we have more restraints as a board than they do. They're free. They're not held by what the rules we are held by. So at any given time, they can put out as the information the same way Lincoln did, as far as I understand it. I don't know if Patrick, anything else, Patrick?
No, I would agree with the statement that you just made.
Okay.
And I do think, it's interesting thinking about it in that context, Don, is one thing, and this may be important for the moderators too, right, is one thing that because they're not bound by some of the same restrictions this board is, or even, myself or Floyd or employees of the district are bound by, they can say, vote yes or vote no. This board cannot do that. So that's something to be thoughtful of in the context of a meeting where both opportunities to be heard are created.
Right. And years ago in Moncton, there was a moderator who at the informational meetings for the school did not allow for another side of the issue. It was strictly a presentation of information and limited at that. So for many years, our school board could not, have presentation. Everybody's different. And so, and things have changed, but I think that's when you have a moderator, that's within their control. You know, definitely we can have a conversation ahead of time, but I'm thinking back to the days in Moncton and it was like, nope, you just provide your information and that's it. So Chris or Bailey?
Don?
Is that Herb?
Yeah, do you have time for just a response? Aaron Jipner sent something that I thought was interesting about whether or not Starksboro has the same sort of ability that Lincoln had to get their message out. Aaron, it's a good point. Of course, you know, the informational meetings were held by Lincoln, so they could go to each town as they were supposed to. Obviously, that's not the case here, and we won't apparently have a role in the informational meeting. The other thing is that, let's face it, they had more resources than little old Starksboro here in terms of getting the message out, flyers, this, that, and the other. We don't have that kind of wherewithal. And just wanted to comment on Patrick's point. Yeah, it's true that the district is not allowed by law to advocate voting yes or voting no. The question I would pose is, at what point is information put together by the district that is so slanted, I guess, that it amounts to advocacy for voting no? Something to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. Chris or Bailey, either of you? Chris?
So just, I don't know if anyone's read the Front Porch Forum here in Bristol from earlier today, but there's a pretty long post that someone posted on behalf of the Save Our Schools, Starksboro Save Our Schools committee that got their points across refuting information that the district has put out. So, you know, they're definitely reaching out, and people can go to the website that they link and get the information there. I think I remember at our last meeting, we have to have a quorum at each of these meetings in each of these towns of the board. Is that true?
Yes, I
okay.
think so.
I was just trying to see if some of us could split off from the first meeting to set up the second meeting in case there were more questions at that one, to try to extend the time frame a little bit so that it wasn't so crunched on everyone packing up from one and getting to the next. So
yes, I was also thinking about that because I know like the town of Moncton has an owl, so maybe we could arrange to have that set up ahead of time. That will cut down on some of the transit time. Steve?
That was exactly my idea. You know, if it might be possible to have the technology simply set up in advance at each of these places, and all we're doing is moving people.
Right.
That would really, I think, you walk in the door and push the button and go.
Yep.
When we that might be worth the cost of whatever it took.
I think the town of Bristol might also have an owl, so that may cover, and we have one, so that's 3, and we would only need 3, so that may help by a few minutes.
Right. Sarah?
These will be hybrid meetings, are they?
I think that's the plan, yes.
Sarah?
Question. It was just if they were hybrid meetings and if board members could be there at, like, I would like to be there at the town I live in, but I'm not sure. I'll see about my ability to travel. And if I can't, I definitely want to be online.
Right. Well, we have that option. We can, that would still count as a quorum if we have some in person and some online. Okay, and Bailey, did you want
to? I just have, I'm just wondering how else we can get the word out about attending these meetings in the town.
And I guess one of my other concerns is because we're labeling it an informational meeting, I would really want to make sure that some of the best information is the discussion. And there might be a very different discussion in New Haven than Moncton or Bristol. And I want to make sure that other people know that they could still attend and listen in to other towns as well. Because if you didn't get your question answered, or maybe you're not the first meeting, but the question was answered at the first meeting, then that might save some time as well.
Okay, thanks for that. When we meet tomorrow, we can hopefully, we'll share all this with Krista and we'll brainstorm some of the communication and getting the word out. Erin?
Yeah, are the meetings that are held in other towns, those Zoom links available for people? Like, so if we're meeting in New Haven, can people from Bristol and Stark, every other town watch that meeting as well? Because okay,
I believe so.
Right, that might be important too, just because other questions might come up.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and I'll just add, remember, this board does not have to have 3 meetings. You could have had 1 informational session and people from all towns came. For good reason, the board wanted to have 3 separate meetings, 1 in each town. So there's no restriction on anything there. So people from multiple towns can come because that was an option with just 1 informational.
Okay. All right, and I see Dennis Casey has his hand up.
Yeah, I wondered how or who determined that only 45 minutes per town would be sufficient, seeing how, you know, Patrick's presentation does take up the lion's share of that 45 minutes.
So the time is not set. It was just a starting place when we started to put things together. We have not set it in stone. It was just a sort of timeline so we could start figuring out how to structure the meeting.
Seems like such an important thing to Starksboro that, you know, just to just to be maybe have 1/4 of the time available to or 1/3 or 1/4 of the time available to put out the what we feel are the correct figures. That I don't know, just a time limit like that just doesn't really smell right to me. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Steve?
So Don, if we've only got, if we're saying that this is just an initial take on the amount of time we're going to have between the meetings, should the board come to some discussions, some agreement here about the amount of time we're going to take? I mean, do we want to do a 4:30 to 8:30, or do we want to?
If you remember when we were talking about the timeline, the admin team is in away and in retreat, and so if I'm remembering correctly, right?
Yeah, it's not so much, that's not going to impact, that's the last day.
Okay.
So we can end in time to make any of the start times work. I think it's a matter of how early do you want to start for the first town and how late do you want to end for the last town, and what impact does that have on participation? I think if the interest is leaning toward longer meetings, frankly, that probably pushes more toward 1 meeting than, like, I don't think you can pull off 3 2-hour meetings in a day. And stretching this over multiple days has its own challenges. So it's the pros and cons of 1 meeting with everyone together hearing the same conversation that can be longer and go more in depth, or it's 3 meetings where it's the same presentation 3 times over. So there's sort of redundancy, at least for the presenters, but the difference would be the dialogue. So someone mentioned earlier an ideal, which I think would be hard to achieve, which is everyone who attends the meeting having seen the presentations first. And then the meeting is almost exclusively Q&A and dialogue. I think that's a high bar to set.
Yeah, I
and
don't
may
think
not be achieved.
I don't think that really meets the intent of an informational meeting. We've warned the vote, but we've not yet warned the informational session.
Correct.
So are we required to do that? Are we required to vote on that tonight?
We will need to warn the informational session. But you don't have to, we need to know the date, because when we warn it will be driven by the date of the meeting. And August 4th, there was some go around in terms of dates. That was in the window that it has to happen by statute, that we were somewhat limited, and that was maybe the only day.
I think it was the only day.
Other than a Saturday or something.
Yeah.
So we already had built-in constraints.
So it's imperative that they all happen on this day.
Well, I think
we have one day that works for this meeting. And then the board talked about wanting to be in the 3 towns and the value in that. But given the how short things have to be to accommodate 3 towns, it's beginning to sound like it should be one big meeting where everybody hears everybody's questions, everybody sees the information, and we're all in one place. Bailey?
This might be completely impossible, but what if we divided and conquered and there were board members in every town, but the meeting was held all at the same time? So like 2 people could be in Moncton and do it and be online, but they could also be physically at the school or wherever we're going to hold it. I think part of online meetings is that maybe people don't have access or they don't have a quiet space, and sometimes they can't hear everything. So if a board member was present with the technology and the ability to use it, they could be a conduit for people who didn't have the technology and who might want to be in person. It's not ideal, but it might give us more time.
I guess I would describe that as theoretically possible and practically impossible is the sense I get. I just think the potential for technical difficulties and people not being able to hear or see or be heard seem significant, I guess I'll say. Maybe we can overcome it. The technology exists, but I feel like it's sometimes kind of clunky. Just the state board meeting today was kind of clunky with technology, and that was all virtual. So there's just some risk with that, I guess, in the setup and being able to pull it off successfully and with high quality.
Sarah?
I was actually going to kind of echo Bailey's idea, just as an option. We sometimes, I guess, just meeting a couple people, like if it was held in person for certain in one town, and then maybe 2 towns had a group of board members at them. But I hear what you're saying about it being clunky. The double, like the triple, it's almost like a triple layer of hybridness instead of a double layer, and that's what makes it miserable. But
okay. Dennis, did you still have a question, or is that your hand from before?
I think it's my hand from before.
Okay.
I just like to say it would be terrific if we had equal time, and I'll end with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So as Krista and I talked last night, there were a couple of things I just needed to sort of have a thumbs on, and in general, and this isn't binding or anything, but is the board in support of this presentation?
The one that Patrick gave?
Yes. So I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Steve is sideways 6, 7. So in supports. Steve, I recognize your sideways thumb.
Yeah, I just think there could be another round of negotiation there, that's all.
Right. So I will take this and share it with Krista as we talk, and maybe we can come up with a plan that it might not accommodate everybody's wishes, but it might provide longer time or something. We'll talk tomorrow and then let you get back to you with it. Did you all see Krista's sort of timeline she put out? Did you get that? I think she sent it, or maybe she just sent a piece of it, but Krista has a sort of schedule to push out information through Front Porch Forum and as stuff. And let me see if she sent it, and maybe I'm telling you something and you didn't get it. So
the only thing she said in her thing to post was that the time and locations for the informational meetings is TBD. So
right. So she's prepared little blurbs to go out in Front Porch Forum, sort of along the lines of what the communication secretary used to do, and she'll share those out to continue to push information. And she will likely add in information from tonight and that link and things like that, so that it keeps everybody up to date on the information. So
I had another question, Dawn.
Sure.
So if we do go to a one info session setup, so we're just doing one meeting, and we have Patrick's presentation for the district's view, are we just then allowing for discourse between Starksboro and MAUSD in terms of getting Starksboro's platform out, or are they able to do a presentation of their own, or how are we gonna handle that?
Well, I think we're gonna have to have a conversation with who we get as impartials to run the meeting. If that's what the board wants to allow time for both sides, then we should share that with them. So I'll need even just a straw poll to let me know, so that as we talk to them, or as we reconnect with them, if Krista's already talked with them.
So what's the straw poll question officially, Dawn?
So I guess I need to know whether board members want to allow space in that meeting for both our information and the Starksboro group's information. So let's see. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 down, and 1, 2, 2 up. So I see 2 up and 4 down. So it looks like it looks like the board's not in support of allowing time for the second presentation. It's our Liz.
Could we also do it? I'm sorry I missed the last meeting, but I did listen to everything about the 3 versus the 1 meeting. Could we do a straw poll again on whether we're doing 1 or 3 tonight?
Okay, so let's see a straw poll on 1 or 3. So 1 meeting, what do you say? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 up. And I see 1, 2 sideways and 1 down. Is that right? Okay, that's on 1 meeting. How about 3 meetings? 1, 2, 3, 3 down. And 1, 2 sideways and 1 up. So it looks like we're more in favor of one meeting, one big meeting. Sarah.
I just know that we dabbled in this with a merger study thing, trying to figure out where to meet people where they were. And it was interesting that people really divided by some people wanted to be in person, some people were happy to do stuff all online, and some people might want to be in like one larger group. So I think even if we go to one meeting, we might want to just at least slightly make available the Bailey proposal, just so we have a spot within each town to kind of really meet people from each town where they are.
Okay, all right. We'll take that into consideration and share. All right. Okay. Anything else? Anyone need a straw poll on?
I just have a question about Sarah's idea as we're thinking about the logistics of that. Would it be, if pulling that off, Sarah, meant, say, a board member from each of the other 2 locations was the spokesperson for that group? So if somebody in the audience there had a question, the board member asked the question. Just because I think that simple technology issues that get in the way, but if there's one person in front of a computer that is the sort of go-between, that can help mitigate that. But if we're trying to hear somebody in the back in the other 2 places and we try to say something and they can't hear, that's where it starts to fall apart. So would that still be acceptable, knowing that the dialogue piece gets lost?
I think that's a good hybridized approach. And if you want your own voice heard, you go to the centralized location.
I like that.
So I think if we're clear about what's going to happen in the 2 towns, that might be the smaller towns, or depending on the venue size, that those 2 towns have this opportunity to be with members of their own town, but this is how we're doing it. I think if we're upfront about how we want to go about it, I think it's a good idea.
Okay. All right. Aaron.
Sorry, Nancy. So I'm still a little confused. I know it's the district's job to put out information and to do that whole thing. I'm still feeling a little on edge about how we're gonna make it so that Starksboro's ideas are also presented or heard if we're not allowing them to give any information. Or I know it's not all worked out yet, but I'm feeling very hesitant about them not being part of that conversation or presentation model. So I don't know how to resolve that, but I just think it would be a big disservice to the rest of the towns that have to vote on other people's futures if that town wasn't allowed to say this is the future we're looking at from their own perspective. And I'm not saying our perspective is wrong or the district's interpretations of things is wrong or anything like that, just saying that I'm not sure how fair it is not to allow that to happen.
Okay, thank you. Nancy.
Could you just repeat the count that you got on the straw poll when you asked whether the meeting should provide time for multiple viewpoints?
I think I got 4 down and 2 up.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I know we're leaving some things hanging, Aaron, and hopefully tomorrow, as Krista and Patrick and I talk, we can get some more clarity and then share out that information with everybody so that, and start spreading it out further and further so that people will know. I did take lots of notes, so I'll share with Krista when we talk tomorrow, and we'll do our best to consider and do what we can to try and make it work. Unless unless there's an objection, I'd like to skip the meeting evaluation for tonight. Does any board members have an objection? All right. Okay, then I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Chris?
Chris, all right. Is there a second?
Second, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, all those in favor of adjourning at 7:01, please say aye.
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 All right, any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you.